I usually start off my reviews by mentioning how I ended up stumbling into the game, but the truth is that Hyperviolent stumbled into me. Thanks to using Lurkit, I received an offer to accept the key. I'm somewhat sure that it's because I've reviewed a game that was published by a company, and I'm assuming that they liked my review of it, so they gave me access to another game that they'll eventually publish. Seeing as how it was another boomer shooter and it was visually appealing, I was willing to give it a try. What almost immediately grabbed my attention about Hyperviolent is how short and to the point it is with its story. The cutscene is around 5 minutes long, maybe less, and I'm sure that some will be bored by it, mainly because it's more about showcasing what the game has to offer in the visual department, and there's not much to it besides more or less being a sample of what's to come. You could say that's something to hold against Hyperviolent, because it's possible to show off parts of a visual medium in such a way that it manages to simultaneously inform and entertain. Still, I like that it showed enough for me to see that it'd be about zombies in space. I was happy with what I saw from the intro cutscene. It featured a cool mix of graphics. It was like pixel art with Half-Life styled environments. I'm sure this isn't the first representation of such a style, seeing as how both pixel-based graphics and Half-Life are decades old, but this still stood out to me. It's because it's been a while since I saw a combination of both. It's usually the case that the graphics for a game are either or, but Hyperviolent features both in an appealing manner. I was especially fond of the early to mid-90s look to certain parts of Hyperviolent, especially with the enemy animations. Once I was actually in-game, it helped that my hands/arms looked a particular way. It comes off like a sort of Doom 2.5 look, and that was a great sight to take in during combat, or other actions where your hands/arms were noticeable. Most of the time I'm playing a game, I'm not drawn in by its music or sound design, but Hyperviolent managed to accomplish that with both. Overall, Hyperviolent features cool electronic music. At times it reminded me of Stranger Things. It wasn't just an 80s ripoff because it managed to come off as atmospheric. It's one thing to put together synth and drum machine sounding beats and call it a day, but it's another thing to do that and have your music create an ambiance. That was especially noticeable to me when I started playing with my headphones, which happened to be Sennheiser HD600s. Those headphones really helped take Hyperviolent's music and sound design to the next level, especially because of the enemy screams. I thought that they were great sounding, but to add a bit more detail, they were very primal and horrible sounding. I realize that to some that might sound like an insult, but when the point is to create a sense of fear and discomfort simply because of a sound, you take that as a compliment. With my headphones on, the enemy screams were truly frightening. It's not as if they worked in the same way as jump scares, but they added to the overall experience I had with Hyperviolent. When it comes to Hyperviolent's gameplay, I thought that it was nice that it offers multiple difficulty settings. The settings range from casual to survival. Not wanting to end up on either extreme, I went with normal. I felt that the difficulty was well balanced and great to work with. There were moments where I died, but at no point did I feel that they were cheap deaths. The majority of the time that usually happened because of a dumb mistake, or because I was too aggressive when I should have been playing it safe. Not having much to work with in the beginning, being able to punch with both hands was cool. I eventually learned that you could dual wield different weapons. Not only that, you could switch up which hand would hold which item/weapon. I usually stuck to my right hand as my weapon hand, but there were brief moments where I equipped two weapons at the same time, one being a melee weapon and the other being some kind of a gun. I thought that being able to punch and or shoot while holding the flashlight was incredibly helpful. I know that some games make it so that you're forced to either hold a weapon or a flashlight individually, which help adds to the tension/level of strategy involved, but I liked how Hyperviolent handled that. I went into Hyperviolent thinking it'd be another boomer shooter, but that's not entirely correct. When you think of boomer shooters, you usually imagine games that are fast-paced, easy to pick up, are retro-styled, and follow a set of guidelines established decades ago. Hyperviolent fits into more than one of those, but the big difference is that it's slow-paced, and in a good way. What I mean is that it's more like System Shock than a full-on boomer shooter. Having only played System Shock 2, I can't say that it's exactly like System Shock 1, so I can only compare Hyperviolent to System Shock 2. I like that Hyperviolent was slow-paced because it helped change things up. Rather than feeling like I was running against a clock, I could take my time, take in what the levels/environments had to offer, and as a result of that, occasionally I'd find additional resources. Some boomer shooters feature secret areas, which tend to be helpful thanks to what you'll find there, but it's also easy to miss out on them when you're running through a level at 100 miles per hour. I generally thought that the slower paced nature of Hyperviolent was good, but at times it felt awkward. It's really due to the item management and reloading of weapons. Item management wasn't as smooth as it could have been. I had to manually move things around in my inventory space, and I felt that it took longer than it should have. I'm pretty sure that this is the case, but from what I experienced, only being able to reload when I ran out of ammo also felt weird to me. Maybe it's because I'm the kind of guy that'll fire 5 bullets when I have 50 and still want to reload, but I want to be in control of that. I felt that reloading and managing my inventory system added extra time to the game when it didn't have to be that way. The point isn't to make Hyperviolent a faster game than it is, but I'd rather have more time to focus on exploring the game or engaging in combat instead of focusing on something tedious. Speaking of combat, there was a good number of enemies and designs. It wasn't just the literal number of enemies I'd encounter in levels, but also the different types of them. The majority were pretty much zombies, but at least their designs were different. I also liked that some had weapons, so that helped keep me on my toes. Had I only been facing melee-based zombies, chances are that I would have just been bored and wouldn't have felt inclined to engage with combat head-on. The different types of enemies helped with that, but it was nice to see that there were a lot of weapons to choose from. Off the top of my head, you had basic weapons such as pipes, batons, pistols, and machine guns, but you also had more experimental weapons. The truth is that I stuck to what I was most familiar with. Due to how one of the experimental weapons was introduced, chances are that it adds a different element to Hyperviolence combat, but I didn't use it enough times to say whether or not it was worth using. I pretty much just stuck to using the pistol, machine guns, and shotgun. You could say that I was pushed towards using those weapons because of the fact that headshots are both doable and useful. At the same time, headshots were sometimes too easy to get. At one point I was barely even aiming at an enemy's head and I still managed to get a headshot. That felt off to me because I played Hyperviolent using a keyboard and mouse. Keyboard and mouse are more accurate than using a controller, but at the same time, if you're not careful, you could end up missing badly. That's why I was caught off guard when I saw bad aim rewarded with a headshot. On the topic of headshots, I thought that Hyperviolent features great carnage. It makes sense, seeing as how the game's titled Hyperviolent. I noticed that graphic displays of gore were usually the result of using the shotgun, as if it wasn't bad enough to the enemies in its base form, it was even better once upgraded. It ended up sounding absolutely sick and that left me wanting to use it more often than the other weapons I had. I had a decent number of weapons to work with, but I didn't feel the need to give them all as much use as I did with, say, the light machine guns or the shotgun. In relation to Hyperviolence gore, I thought it was amusing how flies would show up on corpses after a while. I found that amusing, but at the same time, it was a good indicator to let you know that you'd already been through a specific area. Rather than being stuck in one place, I'd end up feeling inclined to explore. That was especially helpful because the levels were pretty long. The length of the levels wasn't to the point where I felt that they were artificially stretched out, but at the same time, it wasn't like with other retro-styled FPS games where levels can last from 1 to 5 minutes. Take that as another similarity between this game and System Shock 2. Hyperviolent isn't a boomer shooter, but it had one feature that's been well overused. What I'm referring to is having to search for colored keys. At this point I feel that's pretty played out, but it doesn't help that I've played a decent number of boomer shooters over the last year. What was a breath of fresh air was having to read files for a necessary password. You could read all of the available files, but I ignored the majority of them because I wasn't interested. I'm sure that they count as world building and they give you a better idea of what led to the game's present situation. Still, I appreciated how they were short and to the point. I completely read a few of them, but it was easy to find the necessary code in order to advance without having to take in too much fluff. I wish I could say that my overall experience with Hyperviolent was a great one, but then I'd be lying. There were aspects of the game that I greatly enjoyed and want more of, but one big issue I had was that it crashed at a specific point. It might have to do with the fact that Hyperviolent is an early access game, but I still would have liked for that to have not been possible. Due to this game crashing bug taking place at what I assume is a significant part required to advance, I had to stop playing. By that point I felt that I'd seen/enjoyed enough of Hyperviolent to make a first impressions video. Seeing as how Hyperviolent is an early access game, I didn't feel the need to go overboard with trying to find a solution for this game-breaking bug. I viewed it as more than a demo and less than a full version. From what I saw, I'm sure that I'll enjoy the full version of Hyperviolent. The overall retro-styled nature of the game, the music, sound design, enemies, and weapons all stood out to me. If I had been able to play all of what Hyperviolent has to offer, chances are that I would have said give it a chance. Due to that not happening and Hyperviolent being in early access, I'd say you're better off waiting for it to be fully released. I doubt that it'll be fully bug-free once it's released, but chances are that it'll offer a fuller and more polished experience. What are your thoughts on slower-paced FPS games? Do you feel that playing with headphones automatically makes a game better, or does it depend on more than one factor? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and if you're up for it, subscribe to my Patreon. Thank you very much for watching.